Hello and welcome to Coffee Talk Immigration. Today is a very exciting morning because we have the brilliant Brian Dingle here today. He is a Canadian lawyer with one of the biggest elite law firms in Canada. He is beyond business immigration with BLG. We're going to talk about US immigration in Canada and what's driving our business now with all the issues that are surrounding US immigration, and what is happening in Canada, which is making Canada look, as it's always looked, a little bit better. Let's start with the little things about what's happening with US immigration. So with immigration in the United States, we've been hearing a lot of talk, and it's in the newspaper every day, about the H-1B cap, which is the most common work visa we have in the United States for people with a bachelor's degree and in the specialized knowledge category. And as you know, through regulation, there's 65,000 that are granted during the H-1B lottery and 20,000 for US masters. And every year we always have a lottery. It's become that maybe 26% will get it of those who apply, maybe less. And within the H-1B category, there are people who are likely to get it, but also from different countries due to the retrogression in the State Department bulletin. They have to wait many, many years to get their green card. In some cases, they are waiting 10, 15 years is very common. And even though the United States has done a few things within the immigration by allowing employment authorization documents to spouses and other things, it still continues to be a challenge and a wait line that is so long and so many years just to get on the green card path and then just to get your green card. It's become somewhat comical and extraordinarily frustrating for many, many people. And what are the alternatives? And many people hear about tons of alternative Brians. We have J's, we have L's, we have, go back to being an F1 student, many alternatives to stay in the US. But all of them really come down to how long is the wait and when am I going to get on my H-1B, which allows for H-1B extensions beyond the 6 years. Also in the US, we look at things that are every day in the newspaper. Florida now has special rules that will be implemented regarding immigration, leaving a taste in people's mouth that the US may not be as welcoming to talent like it used to be. Long wait lines become very frustrating. We look to our neighbors to the north and we say, well, what is happening in Canada? In what is Canada doing things in response to the talent that the US is unable to satisfy? Talented people that the US cannot satisfy. What do you think, Brian? Does Canada become a good option for certain people who are frustrated here in the US?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you very much for having me to your coffee chat. I think this is a really a nice platform to tell all about the good things that Canada's about. And I had a great presentation all planned for you, like some thoughts about what I could say. But of course, yesterday, the Minister of Immigration launched Canada's first ever talent or tech talent strategy at Collision 2023. So what was already good is now just bonkers. There are so many options. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get through all of them in the time we have. But essentially, I think what Canada is doing is we're seizing on the moment, kind of embracing the notion that we are leaders in global tech talent recruitment and attraction, and seeking to ensure that Canada is able to capitalize on what's going on in the global economy right now. I mean, it's essentially your loss is our gain. because we just see so many benefits, and as a result, there are so many different programs available to you. So if I could start with what I was going to present, is Canada has had since 2017 something called the Global Skills Strategy. Part of that was not only prioritizing processing of certain types of applications, so our equivalent of an H or our equivalent of an L, something along those lines, high-tech roles, professional roles would be processed more expeditiously, regardless of where they were coming from. So if you're coming from the Philippines, if you're coming from India, if you were coming from the United States, they'd all be processed within what was a 14-day timeline, subject to certain logistical issues like medicals and background checks and stuff like that. But in principle, the work permit or the authorization would be adjudicated within a 2-week period. So that was very, very attractive. And not only that, is for an H-1B type application, which we call a labor market impact assessment, which typically required a Canadian employer to demonstrate that it had done certain types of recruiting activities to demonstrate that there weren't qualified Canadians or Canadian permanent residents to do the role. Basically, the government selected a number of in-demand roles that where there was no doubt, there was no question that we needed software developers, we needed data scientists, we needed graphic designers for animation and VFX and things along those lines. And so long as an employer put together what is called a labor market benefits plan, which was an opportunity for basically an employer, a Canadian employer, to meet with the federal government, our equivalent of the Department of Labor, which is called Employment and Social Development Canada. They would come and sit down at the table, explain a bit about their operations, explain a bit about what their their talent needs and desires were. And then they'd come up, they'd negotiate what's called a labor market benefits plan. And basically to say, here's the stuff we're going to do to help train Canadian citizens and Canadian permanent residents, provide job opportunities for Canadian citizens and Canadian permanent residents, and like a bunch of other things like such things as improve financial performance, implement EDI, so equality, diversity, and inclusion kind of programs, a bunch of things, hiring, what would you like interns and partnering with higher educational institutions. You put together a plan.
I mean, right. It sounds like overall, it's a very welcoming approach.
Well, this is the stuff that was in place before yesterday. That's
today
my
is
point.
like, it's a welcoming approach because every day here in the US, it's the Republicans or one of the parties wants to limit this or limit that. Or now if you have someone in Florida starting July 1st, you could be subject to felony harboring charges if you know that your housekeeper is illegal or your construction worker.
Sure. I suppose we have stuff like that too, but it's nowhere near as draconian's not the right word, but it's much more, it's more service oriented. Like think back to when it was the USCIS, like it's a service versus US CBP and DHS, which is all like enforcement minded. Nice. Canada's like, even our enforcement folks, they can be tough, but they're still more service oriented in many respects, certainly in these categories that we're talking about. So it is very welcoming, certainly. But I think the other thing is like if you think about these roles, like if you came up with a plan to say, here's what we're going to do to help expand and grow the company in Canada, ideally not just park people so they could just go back to the United States on an L or something like that, or once the H came through, they go back to the US. The idea that you jump in with both feet and you do business in Canada. In any event, so all these roles would be permitted relatively easily. But as of yesterday, so this first ever tech talent strategy has got a bunch of kind of pillars, I guess I would call them, which are again, looking to capitalize on what's going on in the United States. And basically it's nearshoring. Instead of offshoring stuff to the Philippines or in India or places where you have highly skilled workers doing lots of good stuff, albeit for much less, you're bringing people, you're just taking them across the border. You're sending them up to Calgary, or you're sending them to Vancouver or Toronto. I think there was a recent report by the CBRE, which is like one of the large real estate companies, kind of looking at like the 50 largest tech centers in North America, and I think 11 of them were. I can't remember the statistic, but like Vancouver, like Toronto, I think is number one. Like they're all Canadian destinations. There are others, obviously, in the United States, but Canada is clearly seen as a destination for this type of work.
Well, we hear that a lot of people we go to Canada and work and then wait out the H-1B lottery for next year, just play the lottery game. Will I get picked this year? Will I get picked next year? And then I don't know how many. I've never seen a study that, although people have quoted certain things, I'm not sure what they're basing it on, how many people go to Canada, play that game, and then once they get to the H-1B, come back here. And I always wondered if Canada was going to say, once you're in, you're in. Right. We can't have that, or does it matter? I don't know.
It's a really interesting question because, and that let's to get an H. You're not even talking about a green card. So what's really interesting about Canada's immigration system, writ large, I guess, is not only are we open to temporary talent, temporary residents, we're absolutely keen to have them transition to permanent resident status.
I see that Marcela Bermudez, our immigration partner, just joined us from GM, and we're so happy that she joined us. So we can continue our discussion on the US is losing talent, and that talent is going to a very welcoming country called Canada. And some of the reasons it's welcoming is also because of their requirements for permanent residency, which makes a big difference when people are in a country and trying to be part and integrate themselves within that country. And I know a lot of things changed recently with Canada. And if you could continue, Brian, on that discussion with people who are waiting for their H-1B, but then they become permanent residents because the path is a little clearer than in the US.
Mm-hmm. In fact, that's one of the major distinctions I would draw between Canada and the United States. So in Canada, it's relatively straightforward to become a permanent resident. You don't need to do it necessarily with the support of employer. Certainly it will help, but you'll find many people come to Canada as permanent residents, as skilled workers, as opposed to family-based petitions, on the strength of their own, we call them comprehensive ranking system points. So we rank people based on language ability in both official languages, both French and English, educational attainment, work experience, both in Canada and abroad, and a bunch of other kind of what we call adaptability factors. So things like whether the spouse has worked, whether they have done English or French tests, whether they're family members here. But it's quite interesting. So we've created, what had happened was, we always attracted a lot of applicants. It was how to gatekeep, how to ensure that you didn't have, it didn't take 6 years if you're applying through Pakistan versus 9 months in Sydney, Australia. And so we've put in place what's called express entry, which is a gatekeeper kind of mechanism. So everybody goes into a pool typically. So everybody throws their name in a hat, and depending on how they sit in the pool, so what kind of comprehensive ranking system points they're assigned when they create their profile, every 2 or 3 weeks, the government will come through and like skim the cream off the top, so to speak. And so it will all depend, like, are you single? Do you have a PhD? Did you obtain your PhD in the United States or in India or France, or was it obtained in Canada? And so you're all ranked based on these human capital factors. And the big the big thing of interest is that it's done typically within 6 months of making the application. You're not necessarily
So can you
guaranteed being
advise your
drawn.
clients? Could you advise your clients a little bit? Because ours, very limited on where you can self-sponsor, very
Yeah,
limited.
yeah.
And also the certainty, excuse me, in a point system, you can tell your client, yes, you're sitting in a pool with others, but you have, a PhD from
Mhm.
Harvard, let's pretending. Therefore, you have more points than,
Right. Well,
so they have a certainty of being picked at a certain point.
so
Because immigration has, in the US, there's a lot of uncertainty, I think. The wait lines and the this, and there's always something that, happens that is frustrating for a family.
absolutely. I think the thing I would say is we have uncertainty too. Like I never could say to a client, you with absolute certainty will be drawn. I would say I used to say that I feel I'm honest to a fault and sometimes to my detriment when it comes to, like, for instance, when I talk to employer clients, we could design a system whereby you support your employee to transition to the equivalent of green card. Here's what you do. Often my advice is, like, it's a business decision. Do you need to do this? Keeping in mind that the individual likely can transition without your assistance. Um, if they do slightly better in their language test versus you going through these hoops, which cost money and take longer and raise employer compliance regime issues, and et cetera, et cetera. Like, you can do it if it's a retention tool, if it makes business sense to do so, or you can choose not to. And chances are they'll probably be a permanent resident 3 to 6 months sooner if they do what the individual employee wants, versus what I'm saying, you can, but you don't have to. It's more a business decision than a legal decision. But I think the thing that is most interesting is, I'm sure you face this in the United States, where the priorities change for something, and like all your clients jump on it because they know about it because they're in these chat rooms and whatnot. Everybody's kind of informing themselves, and they, because so much of it can be done without an employer. There's a lot more. Um, Not uncertainty, but the employers tend not to know as much about what is required because they don't have to do it. Half the time people become aware, or employers become aware, that their employees have transitioned to permanent resident status because they pop in and they say, oh, I've got a new social insurance number, which is like an SSN in the US. All temporary foreign workers have a social insurance number that starts with a 9, and it has an expiry date. And then as soon as they get a permanent resident status card, they come in with a new PR card. So half the time the employers don't do it.
Yeah, that is so different, because
it's so different.
It's the opposite here.
Yeah, the
Well, and
employers are very much in control.
I mean,
Not all-
what's the frequency that they draw from the pool? Let's say you have, if everyone's going mainly, is it, how many
2 to
times
3
a year?
weeks, 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay.
So it's
rolling
constant.
selection.
So just to put this in perspective, Canada's commitment, or its stated intention, is to transition 1.5 million people into permanent resident status in the next 3 years. So that's roughly 500,000 people a year. So compare that to what you're doing in the United States right now, and consider that we're the size of California from a population perspective. Those are pretty aggressive targets. But full steam ahead. We're going as quickly as we can, and we keep opening new programs. So Marcel, what I was saying yesterday, just yesterday, the minister announced a new tech talent recruitment and attraction strategy for basically focusing on low-hanging fruit, which is all the folks who are in the United States who are unable to transition to either an H or to subsequently get a green card. I don't know, Patricia, if you wanted me to go through, but I could go through the 4 pillars and kind of explain all these new announcements. And I would say, these are announcements. Like we don't have the like the I don't think there'll be a regulatory impact assessment statement. Like I don't think it's going to be in the legislation. I think these are just going to be program directives and temporary public policies issued by the minister, just saying, you know, from here on in until this time, we're going to be doing this, and that. So if I could start in, one of the things is they will be developing what's called a new innovation stream under the International Mobility Program, and that's geared towards attracting highly talented individuals. So the feedback basically has led immigration to create two streams. One is an employer-specific work permit, which could be valid for up to 5 years. And that it's not clear if it'll be full 5 years or whether it's 3 years and then a 2-year increment or something like that. But for 5 years for workers destined to work for a company identified by the Government of Canada as contributing to its innovation goals. So if you have an employer, I'm trying to be careful about not naming anybody we represent, but you know, anybody in the tech sector, like basically anyone. If you are identified by the Government of Canada, you will potentially be able to bring in individuals on a work permit solely on the strength of perhaps the role itself. I'm thinking software developer, programmers, things along those lines, potentially engineers, you know, mining, construction, things along those lines. So long as the employer is identified, you might be able to get a work permit without anything more other than the job offer in a particular category.
So if we were like Apple or Dell or Google or
Telecom, any telecom.
yeah, any name, right?
Sure.
It would be like pretty easy.
Yeah. And we don't know what the, like, do we know whether the employer has to go? Will they be tapped? So for instance, I have represented a client, or I continue to represent a client that moved. It's in the IT space, like information management and whatnot. It moved its head offices from the UK and New York to Toronto, and you know, they were basically the prototypical, like that was the entity for which the whole program, the global talent stream thing, was designed. They didn't even have to be tapped. They don't actually use it because the other programs are quite good. But you know, it could be that the government just says, like, here are 25, you know, like an Apple, like a Dell, you know, they'll just say you're contributing. You can have as many as you like. Similarly, like as part of the same stream, they're having an open work permit for up to 5 years for highly skilled workers in select in-demand occupations. We don't know what those are yet, but that's like getting, I don't know what the equivalent, it's like an H without an employer. Like I wouldn't say you're a free agent, because you know, if you want to transition to permanent resident status, chances are you want to have a named employer, because it helps to transition as part of those comprehensive ranking system points. But nevertheless, you know, at 5 years, that's more than enough time to transition to permanent resident status. And I would also suggest that the government is likely to make further changes that would say, you know, if you came in under this stream and you have an intention of transitioning to permanent resident status, they may change the comprehensive ranking system points that would be attributed to those individuals.
Does that give them possibility of, if they don't have an employer identified, of entering and being self-employed, or do they have to time to find an employer?
Well, it's interesting. I bet you nickel, it's not clear yet, but self-employment is possible. Self-employment doesn't help you if you want to transition to permanent resident status, because you can't claim what are called arranged employment points, which often are required to become a permanent resident. But nevertheless, nothing prevents you from hanging out your own shingle, doing your own thing. I mean, you might even be able to contract back to your old employer in the United States as an independent contractor or something like that. And that's not to say you can't transition to permanent resident status, but you may not be selected quite as quickly, unless there are future changes made. Because, you know, I was joking. There's another announcement. It's probably in process right now at 11:43 or 46 in Canada, where they're doing something along these lines for the healthcare sector. so everything, yesterday was about the tech sector. Today is healthcare. Well, now when we're done this, I'll go figure out what that's about. But I would also suggest digital nomads, which I think some other countries got a quick,
Yeah,
like
there's
a
a lot
leg
of
up
other
on
countries,
during the pandemic.
Italy, France.
Yeah, we want to go.
Absolutely.
I myself in Paris working, but
Yeah. Well, digital nomads are quite interesting because I know, because your practice is quite a bit like ours. Immigration is but one consideration. You've got like cybersecurity and technology and privacy, data privacy and stuff like that, in addition to tax. So a lot of digital nomads saying, to hell with you, I'm off to, Costa Rica. I may not be as concerned about Costa Rica, but when you come to a place like Canada, where we tax based on residency, you're potentially creating a nexus for not only yourself. I mean, you most certainly are creating something for yourself, most likely. You also are potentially creating something for your employer. So certainly there's a new push towards promoting Canada as a destination for digital nomads. If it'll be interesting to see if part and parcel of this announcement from an immigration standpoint, there's some kind of tax, I wouldn't say relief, but some kind of special program for digital nomads. But I think the idea is that once upon a time, typically people would only come in 6 months, and so long as it was telework, like it was relating entirely to what was going on outside of Canada, you were okay. But you were typically held to no more than 6 months, unless you could demonstrate a need to be here for a longer period. But it looks as though they're going to be working at creating new policies to see if they could expand that, which it sounds as though is likely to take place. But then again, it also sounds as though those who are here as tech or digital nomads can also transition to work permits for Canadian employers much more easily. I mean, these are great statements. They're all bullet points. We have no idea what they hold, but I mean, it's pretty exciting. And I think
the digital nomads people ask about all the time as well.
Yeah.
And again, the same concerns that you have: data privacy rules, security rules, cyber rules. Individuals might be hit with a big tax from that country, and they're like, but I only spent 8 months there. Individuals. Corporate taxation, they should get, I don't know how that pans out. And then the employment law itself. What if you're there 1 year, 2 year, 3 year? What if you get fired? Whose law is it?
Right.
You may want that law in Europe to be upheld, as opposed to US law from certain states. A lot of these employees don't have contracts. They don't have specifications.
Yeah.
And we have employers who didn't even know someone was in Italy for a year. Just surprise, just had no idea.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the thing that is like, from a Canadian perspective, the teleworking is fine. Like you can do it. It's what kind of employment and tax chaos have you created for yourself and for your employer? Canadian employment law is very, very we're like California and then some. So we're very, we're very pro-employee. Certain provinces and territories are more pro-employees than others, but in comparison to the United States, I think we're all probably much more so. And then our tax regime is quite interesting because, again, it's not just the individual's tax consideration. Like, if you have a bunch of digital nomads tearing around, like, you may have created sufficient nexus that you've got a permanent establishment, even though you didn't,
intend on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have an example of a pretty big hedge fund who's one of the portfolio managers, shacked up with his cousin in Vancouver during the pandemic, and you could hear who was on the other side of the call. Like, you could hear the jaws drop and, like, what have we done? Or like this, how are we going to fix this?
I know the lawyers are always like bringing up all the liability issues that nobody wants to hear, when people are like calmly making money.
Well, it's quite funny because I say, like, immigration does what tax tells us to do. So I mean, I just have to make it work from it, but you always have to say, you need to speak to your tax colleagues. You need to understand from a finance perspective. You need to because sometimes if it's too good to be true, it probably is, I guess. So,
Right.
but Canada's tax regime is quite a bit different, and you do need to be mindful of that and get proper advice before you allow these digital nomads to start tearing around. So the other thing that I was going to talk about was the third pillar is like improving labor mobility in North America by creating a streamlined work permit for H-1B specialty occupation visa holders in the US to apply to come to Canada. So that's separate and apart from everything we've talked about so far, like employer who are contributing to innovation, open work permits for people who are going to contribute to that. There's going to be, as I understand it, the policy or the measure will remain in effect for at least a year or until it receives 10,000 applications of principal applicants. So like if you've got a family of 4, a nuclear family of 4, that's 40,000 people who could theoretically come to Canada. Basically, they'll receive an open work permit, like they can apply. They'll receive an open work permit valid for up to 3 years. The expectation would be they would transition to permanent resident status or find some kind of employer who could sponsor them.
If you keep talking about this, Marcel and I may apply for this program.
I'd probably bring you in I'd bring you guys in as TNs. It'd be deadly simple.
Okay. All right.
We got to find you an employer. I mean, it could theoretically work. I mean, you have to get yourself an H-1B, so I guess you'd have to renounce first, and then get yourself yourself the number.
But I mean, it's so welcoming that I'm surprised that we're not getting this. It'll be interesting to see how quickly this fills. And from whom? From what country?
Absolutely.
We're talking about people who have had to have been selected for the H-1B.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Probably those who are at the tail end can't transition, and are fed up. What I can tell you, what I can tell you is,
weren't selected.
I know, but it doesn't solve who's not been selected, but right. It does help with the green card, because what are they going to do? Wait another 12 years?
Yeah. Especially now that we just hit another retrogression.
What I can tell you is the program will open on July 16th. This gives you an idea of how quickly things work here. Yeah. So in about 3 weeks time, if these people are interested in applying, we don't know what the program requirements are. They haven't been published yet. We don't but it's that quick. They're going to be up and operational. There'll be some operational guidance to officers provided shortly. And these are individuals who may be your current employees who are going to be telling you, oh, I got an open work permit for Canada. My family and I are going to go to Montreal. We're going to go to Vancouver. I may continue working for you. I might get a new job. It'll be very interesting to see. So that's really exciting. And there was a reason why this. Yeah, but there was a reason why they announced this at Collision 2023, one of these big tech, mashups where they have conventions and whatnot. I think we had an ill-fated kind of start maybe a few years ago when we spent a lot of money. Canada spent a lot of money promoting the startup visa program for individuals in the United States, like in Silicon Valley, who weren't able to do to be able to get H's or secure work authorization for the United States. The startup visa proved to be, in my opinion, quite clunky. It takes forever to be approved. You have to have an angel investor or some kind of approved investment made in your company. You still have to have a controlling interest. This will just allow a lot of people to come, not just this one, but the other 2 programs as well. This will allow people just to come and do the same thing just in Canada and without all the red tape. They'll be doing this. They'll create their own their companies, and they'll be able to transition to permanent resident status on their own. Then the last pillar is just to improve existing programs that cater to workers in high skill and especially high tech occupations. So we mentioned the global skills strategy at the outset. That's the thing that was announced in 2007. Following or during the pandemic, we had certain service standards that were expected of these programs, like the 14-day processing for certain types of roles and employers and whatnot, which just went out the window because of the pandemic. Like, I'm sure it was the same in the US. Visa offices were closed. Application processing centers, like service centers in Vermont and California, probably just shut down. Unlike our firm, which I think we went fully digital and remote within like a week. Everybody got a laptop, and I've been living in my basement for 3 years, kind of thing. The government of Canada, everybody had desktop computers that were wired to the floor, and they couldn't go in and grab them. So we stopped processing for about 9 months. It was like everything was shut, and everybody was very unhappy. We're trying to get right back to where we were before the pandemic, increase processing times just to get back to where we were. So if you can get somebody out of India or maybe not China. Actually, we'll do a little asterisk about China. But if you wanted people to come from certain countries very quickly, you could do that, even if they're from countries that require medicals and require visas. Because unlike the United States, actually, that's a good interesting point to make, is like Australians, if you wanted an E3 equivalent, an Australian can apply for a work permit directly at the port of entry, like a Canadian can do a TN into the US. So Brits, French nationals, Hong Kong, special administrative regional passport holders, stuff like that, all can apply directly at the port of entry. There's no need to go to a visa office. So this really is exciting for individuals who come from countries that require a visa, because you'd be looking at like a 6-month wait or 9-month wait, which was really, really challenging. The reason I put a little asterisk against China is, and I'm assuming that we're piggybacking on your kind of approach to the military civil fusion strategy, where anybody involved in high tech, like AI, big data, aeronautics, anything that has sensitive and dual application, like military civilian kind of applications, are still going to be subject to administrative background checks. So our background checks are informed not only by what our security services do, but I'm sure by like the Five Eyes and other security agencies. So like not just the UK and the United States, Australia and New Zealand, but others. So it is not surprising that many cases that are processed for Chinese nationals, even if they're in the United States on H, for instance, they'll probably face additional scrutiny and could take much longer than the advertised, 15-day processing time and whatnot. So that's just something to keep in mind, because a lot of tech talent tends to come from China. And if you're on a list, if you've gone to a university that is, even if it's a civilian university in China that is on the list of institutions that help with this fusion, military civilian fusion strategy, you're likely going to face delays in processing. That was a bit of a sidetrack.
No, it's just the same thing here. I mean, we have
Yeah.
a lot of, aside from the export rule, we have a lot of other rules and regulation background checks from key countries that always seem to be, again, backlogging the process. And,
Yep.
but, we're coming up to the end of our coffee talk time, but I wanted to just say that thank you for coming and speaking to us, because it's very important. I do think that the US is in many respects missing out on incredible opportunities from innovative foreign nationals throughout the world, due to our own, shall I say, internal disagreements.
Well, I was going to say, maybe they could become Canadians. All these individuals can become Canadians, and then you can have them back, because you can do TNs for them.
Yes, exactly. That's the way to do it. They become
Or an
Canadian
E2.
citizens and then come back.
Yeah.
That's the way to do it. So I do think that And I think we should have coming up a coffee talk on healthcare, specifically Canada and the US, because it's a big issue here as it is with you. And that's different than IT.
It is very difficult, and you know, I haven't
Right now we're talking about IT. I don't want everyone to get the impression that everything is free flowing in Canada.
yeah. Well,
There's
it is
other-
interesting because I think healthcare is a, as you say, a different kettle of fish, and we struggle with that mostly because of the various levels of government which have input on regulation. And the regulatory bodies, like the professional bodies that self-govern and whatnot, in each different jurisdiction have different different requirements. And I think I can't recall whether this was part of our recorded discussion or not, but there are some pieces on the CBC, Canada's the Canadian Broadcasting Service, I guess a bit like NPR, is reporting that, you know, foreign trained Canadian citizens who are physicians, for instance, are having difficulty being recognized when they come home. So it's not restricted to immigration. I think it's a bigger issue, but it would be a very interesting one. And as I said, I'll go have a look at what the minister has announced not half an hour ago, about what kind of improvements and developments are coming to healthcare. But absolutely, that could be an excellent next chat.
And Marcella, did you have any last comments, or just
No.
so glad we have you,
Yeah.
Brian?
No, but what I really, for us, I guess one of the most important, having a large pool of people who weren't selected for the cap, it was disastrous. Their options is really how to get out. If I can go to Canada and work remote, you know, same time zone as opposed to going to Europe, going to Asia.
Absolutely.
That's
And employers can, I think it's not just, the funny thing is, like, individual employees can tackle this themselves. Employers probably can come up with strategies themselves, like whether they decide to set up shop in Canada, have an R&D center that's servicing the US or European markets, or whatever the case may be, or maybe they're using employer of records. I mean, I have not been involved with EORs quite as much, because from an immigration standpoint, I think it's a bit funky. It adds some issues for like stock options and things like that, which, you know, sometimes are not considered. But I mean, there are a bunch of things that can be done, and I just think that the question will be figure out which is most optimal, or you know, most likely to be approved. Like it's like you're just going to have, like, well, you could do any of the three. It doesn't matter. Like, as long as you get yourself here, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, well, we'll have a follow-up discussion on that, because we're going to start seeing reports about what is happening,
mhm.
and it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to track
And
it.
how easy it's gonna get implemented. That's
Yeah.
always, I mean,
Yeah.
on our end, it takes much longer for the
Red
US
tape
to
is
roll
like
out
the key
anything.
here. We are just levels and levels.
Well, that's very, because of the way the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act is structured, like it's framework legislation, where everything is like the meat and potatoes is are in the regs. And not only that, is the regs actually empower the minister to make certain public policies. So the minister can just say, you know, by making a temporary public policy, like during the pandemic, in order to help out with you know, in-demand jobs, he changed the you know, foreign students could only work under our equivalent of an EAD while at school. It's not quite an EAD, but it's their work authorized while at school. He changed the cap from 20 hours to no max. So I mean, just with a temporary public policy, and it helped. I mean, there's all sorts of chaos now, because the temporary public policies are hard to follow because they're not in the legislation. So it's hard to keep on top of it. It's good work for lawyers, however. So we're having a bit of a boondoggle.
Good for us.
Good for us. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we want to thank you again, Brian, and thank you so much, and Marcella.
Thank you very much.
We really appreciate
Keep
it.
us posted.
Keep us
That's
posted.
great fun. Absolutely.
Reach
That was
out.
very.
Thank
It
you
was great
again.
fun. Thanks so much.